Good morning, I'm Ron Levy with the Grumman Owners and Pilots Association. I'm a PFP instructor and I'm also the former safety director of the GOPA. Getting used to saying GOPA instead of AYA, that's tough. We're going to talk this morning about doing a pre-flight on a Grumman Tiger and the other Grumman airplanes. A couple of things I'd like to say up front on doing pre-flight and walk-around inspection. I don't carry the checklist with me. I have a number of reasons for doing that. First of all, it generally takes two hands to do some of the pre-flight tasks, and then you got no place to put the checklist. And secondly, people tend to stare at the checklist instead of watching the airplane. I had an experience some years ago when I was instructing. We'd been out in a 172 the night before doing instrument work, and the next morning I was doing a VFR private student in the same plane. And as we walked out to the airplane, I noticed that right about here was what looked like a giant bug splat like this, and I saw that from about 50 feet away. Well, I just filed that in my head. The student goes out, gets his paper checklist, and he's walking around the airplane looking at the checklist, looking at that item, looking at the checklist, looking at that item, looking at the checklist, looking at that item. He gets all the way around the airplane and gets back to the pilot's door and says, "Looks like it's good to go." And I said, "What about the bird strike?" "What bird strike?" "This one up here." "Oh my God, I didn't see that," because he was busy looking at the checklist. So the way that I teach using the checklist on the pre-flight is that before you start the pre-flight, pull out the checklist and go through it. Then do the walk-around. And then go through it again to make sure you checked everything. For some people, what they'll want to do is look at the first section, you know, the wing section or the tail section. Look at the checklist, put the checklist in your pocket, then check it. Then when you're done with that section, run through the checklist again for that section, and then preview the next section, do the section, and then review it. But trying to do the pre-flight inspection with your checklist in your hand is counterproductive. Enough said. So when I get out of the airplane after doing the cockpit checks, first thing that I do is look at the underside of the airplane. Now, this is part of your physical training regimen, because the way I do that is to come down here and look at the belly of the plane. I'm looking for signs of excessive fresh oil. I'm looking for signs of excessive burnt products in the exhaust. I'm looking for the static port. Don't touch the static port, because you don't want the oils and things on your fingers, even that little bit of skin oil, getting into the static system can clog up the system. So look, but don't touch. Now, being old, age doth make presbyopics of us all, as the Bard of Avon sort of said. And I've got my flashlight handy. I'm going to take a look, make sure that static port is clear. Coming around, we're now going to get into some of the Grumman specific things. The next thing I'm going to look at, in the lightning holes here, to make sure that there's no bird's nests in there. And if you park your plane outside, it's not a matter of if, but when you find some bird nest debris in there. And it's tricky to pull it out. You'll need some kind of device with little claws you can pull things out with. Some people put either aluminum tape over them, which I don't recommend because now you're encouraging the corrosion. Some people cut screening material and attach that here. That sounds like a good idea. I don't have any problem with birds in my hangar, so I haven't done that. I'll go ahead, get free movement of the elevator, and then I'm going to make a check to see if the elevator is adjusted evenly. I'm lined up here. I'm going to look over at the other side, and I can see that the other side is also even with the stabilizer. Now, what can happen is that over time, the bolts in the tail cone, which hold the elevator mechanism together there, can get a little bit worn and the bolt holes get elongated, and then you can start to get a mismatch. And it's important to catch this early, because if the bolt holes get too elongated, they can't be repaired. You have to replace the assembly. And repair is a lot cheaper than replace. Coming around to the back side, just again, free movement, making sure that the trim tab is moving freely, as well as the elevator. Now here we get to another spot where I'm going to go ahead and look inside the tail cone. Now, to see this, we'd have to pull the tail cone to really see what I'm looking at. But I'm going to go ahead and look inside, and the flange that holds the elevator assembly has 4 bolts, one in each corner where it attaches to the aft closure bulkhead. You want to look at the flange around those bolt heads for cracks. If you see cracks, you need to ground the plane and get a new flange, because if one of those things breaks, the whole elevator falls off, and then the plane gets really hard to fly. I also checked the rudder for free movement. Now, you know, we've got the placard that's on many of these that says no push. So if you're going to do this, do it here where the rib is. So you're not using the skin, you're using the rib to move it. Just check for free movement and it comes back to the center. Also take the opportunity to look up at the tail light, at the beacon assembly, make sure that is secure. I remember one time many years ago on our old Cheetah, walked out to the plane and the jelly jar light was hanging by the wires. Probably landed that way. Trim tab, I'm looking at the trim tab to see that it is secure, the rivets are in place, it is secure, and it hasn't separated from the rudder. As we come around the side here, I forgot to mention on the left side, we're next looking at the trim arms here. And these trim arms, you see how this bolt is stationary and the trim arm slides up and down on the bolt. What we're looking for is to see that when you're in normal flight, you see how far aft the bolt is on the trim arm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the trim arm and this spot where the bolt sits in level flight and see if there's any indentation. You can have a little bit, all right? There can be a little. And this is actually the second set of trim arms on this airplane, because about 15 years ago, these were getting worn to the point that when I was flying, I was in a formation, and they said that the trim tab was moving up and down in flight, that they could see. And sure enough, this was excessively worn, so we replaced both trim arms, and that took care of the problem. You also want to make sure that the cotter pin back here is installed, and if you don't have one of these big washers, they didn't come from the factory that way. They came with little bitty washers, barely bigger than the bolt head. But go ahead and get your mechanic to install the large washers instead of the little mini ones. Coming around to the right side, checking basically the same things I was checking on the left, free movement, and taking a look for birds' nests in here. No sign of any material. On the right side, the same check of the static port that we would do. Now I'm going to take a look up here at the dorsal fin, and what you will see is cracks that will develop radiating from the rivets. I should have checked that on the other side. Pretend that I did. And when you see cracks developing, it's time to replace the dorsal fin. Obviously the ELT antenna here, making sure that's not broken off, because if it is, it won't work nearly as well. COM antenna, checking for sealant, and security. And then we'll be coming down to the right-hand step. As we come to the right-hand step, we're checking the step for security. Now, as I finish with the step, I will also check the fairing, which should have just a little free play, but it shouldn't flop. If it does, there's a bolt up there which has come loose. And I notice, looking down here, that I've got the gap seal rubber. And if you can, you'll get this later, but the gap seal has come loose a little bit, and I'm going to have to reset that, reseat it. But the this is good on the fairing. The flap bearing, there's two types you may see. And in fact, you may see both types on one airplane. This plane came from the factory with the roller bearing on the right side and the different plate bearing on the other side. Now the roller bearing, you just want to check for a little bit of free play. Okay, when we see here, instead of a roller bearing, we've got a bearing plate here. These bearing plates were originally made with steel. And that sounds like a good idea. The only problem is the metal that it's bolted, that it's riveted to, is aluminum. And when you put steel up on aluminum, you can get dissimilar metal corrosion. In fact, this plate here is an aluminum plate that was just installed about 6 months ago because I noticed that I was beginning to see some signs of corrosion along the steel plate that used to be there. It's not a big deal to replace the plate, except that you have to pull the aileron and flap to do it. So it's a lot of work. But if this corrosion is not treated quickly, it will actually corrode the closure spar at the back end of the fuel tank, and now you're going to have to pretty much take the wing apart and put it back together to replace that entire rib. That's expensive. So look at this. If you have one of these with no roller, you might want to take a magnet and check it to see if it is steel or aluminum. And if it's steel, look for signs of corrosion. When we get out to the end of the flap, we're looking at the bearing point here where the flap torque tube ends and the aileron torque tube picks up going out, and just checking to see if there's any free play in the bearing. And if there's more than 30 thousandths of free play, you need a new bearing. The bearings are cheap, but it does mean pulling the flap and aileron to do it. Coming out, just normal free play, making sure that they're moving in the opposite direction. And of course, the flap goes down, or excuse me, the aileron goes down more than it goes up. If the aileron does not go down more than it goes up, then the aileron stops located in here in the, you have to take the wingtip off to see them, are installed upside down. That's one of those violations of Murphy's Law when they designed this airplane, that if an aircraft part can be installed upside down, somebody will do it. And unfortunately, they did design them in a way that they can be installed upside down, and that will create issues. So just check to make sure that you get more play down than up. Down here, checking the aileron trim tab once again, looking for any signs of separation or the rivets coming loose. Coming around the wingtip, I just want to check the aileron counterweight for security and take a look up in here to see if there's any signs of birds setting up house. It's happened. It's one reason that if you're outside, you make sure that you put in the control lock for parking, because the birds have trouble getting past the counterweight, but if it's wide open, they'll get in there. wingtip, just looking at the condition and transparency of the wingtip light cover. Then coming down here to another gotcha point, which is the fuel tank vent. And we want to look up and see that it's clear. If you're in country where there's mud daubers, they will get up there, they will plug it, then your fuel tank won't vent. And the fuel pump sucks hard enough that it can actually pull and deform the upper skin of the tank. Moving on from the fuel tank vent, checking the security of the stall strips and making sure that they're secured on properly. At the factory, they were both glued and bolted. Then, of course, the stall warning, looking to make sure that it moves freely. And you also want to periodically turn on the master and check that it does sound when you lift it up. We get now to the fuel caps. Now this is a 79, and the 79 Tigers and Cheetahs and all of the AG5Bs have this mil-spec type fuel cap. At least at your annual inspection, you want to check to see the condition of these rubber O-ring here around the top. And there's another one inside that you can't see. Because this fuel cap assembly, the way the fuel cap is here, there's no scupper drain like the ones you see in the other Grummins. Looking for the fuel level, and I always secure it so the tab goes straight back. Fueled sump drain. Now I'm not going to drain the fuel right now because we're sitting in the hangar and I don't want fuel on the ground in here. But remember that you do want to check both the tank drain here and the sump drain down here. You want to look for water, contaminants, anything like that. Okay, down here we're looking at the tank covers, which are sealed. Here, 4 of them for each tank. What you're looking for is any sign of staining to show that fuel is leaking. And if that happens, you're in for some fun, because you're going to have to drain the tank and break those loose and clean them and reseal them and put them back together again. We have the other stall strip here. Looking at the condition of this flap, the fairing and the rubber strip. And now we're moving in towards the engine. Periodically take a look up the exhaust stack to see the condition of the shroud with all the little holes in it. It looks like one of those air-cooled machine gun fairings, and you want to see that it's in good condition, it's not burned out, anything like that. You can also take a look to see the color of the exhaust residue on the inside of the stack. Nice light gray, it's nice clean ash. If you see brown or grease, then you got other issues to deal with the engine. Now, as you can see, this has got the Lopresti nose bowl assembly with the scoop on the side to feed the induction air to the carburetor. And I'll open it up. By the way, after about 30 years or so, you'll see that these struts will tend to break right here at where it goes flat and bends. Fletchair has replacements, and it's a pretty easy remove and replace. You may want to replace the little snap button on the back of the fairing, on the back of the baffling, because if that gets loose, then the wind can grab it and slam it either all the way open or drop it on your head. Checking the oil level, which looks like it's about 6 1/4. These engines tend to blow out a certain amount of oil through the breather if the sump level's too high. Now I know this is an 8-quart capacity sump, resist the temptation to put 8 quarts in it. Typically, the 0360s tend to hold 6 to 6.5 quarts. If you put any more than that in, it's probably just going to blow it out the breather, and then you get a lot of oil on the belly of your airplane. So if you fill it to 7 quarts and fly for half an hour, when you come back you'll have 6.5 or so. If you fill it to 7 quarts and fly for 2 hours, you'll have the same 6.5 or so. Find out what your airplane tends to hold and then keep it at that level. In the engine compartment, next thing I'm looking at is the condition and placement of the baffle seals. The baffle seals should be flush against the top of the cowl in flight. And you can see some of that by looking at the marks on the baffle seals and the marks on the cowling. And you can see on mine that we've added some canvas tape to help make a better seal. That helps get your cylinder head temperatures lower. Beyond that, it's mostly a matter of nothing hanging, nothing dripping. Knowing what everything should be, looking to see that everything is tied together. Now, because I have the Lopresti nose bowl, I have the scat tube comes from the air duct down here. Now, Bob's Tiger has got the stock induction system where the air comes in through the baffle and through this flange. And when I look at it, I'm looking to see that it's tight and secure and that there's no leakage. This Adel clamp isn't real good at securing square things. This looks pretty good right here, and then it comes through, and I see that one nice thing is somebody put some RTV or something there to pad this and keep it from beating itself up on the engine mounts. Also make sure that the baffle seals come together neatly here. Sometimes you may need to put a little pop rivet there and a little RTV on it to keep it from scratching up the cowling to hold the baffle seal properly here. Mine sits pretty good. Looking inside for any sign of leakage, oil, any loose wires, any fluids on the inside of the engine compartment. All looks pretty good except for that spark plug wire. You may notice that this Tiger has cheetah louvers. And that's because this Tiger isn't really a Tiger. This is a converted cheetah. And the nose cowling retains the 3 louvers on each side from the cheetah. Now if you want, you can hammer them shut if you do that conversion. But it seems to get me better cooling this way, so I left it alone. I'm being pretty careful about how I pull this strut away because I don't want to stress it right here. So I've got fingers behind so that I can rotate it out. Coming down on the cowl, making sure I get the pins inside so they don't scratch up the paint here. And now we're secure. I've got both tabs flush. Now coming around the front, just checking the prop, checking the leading edge for nicks, checking the leading edge of the prop for nicks, both sides. You hear that nice, not a dead sound. If you do this and don't hear that nice ringing, you may have a crack somewhere in the prop. Very bad news. Checking all this, this has the heavy duty spinner. It's got 2 rows of bolt heads. Checking around, make sure none of them are loose. And one other thing you can check, I'm turning it backwards, you notice, is up here in the air duct where the baffle seal material comes off. Sometimes you'll find that it is slipped down and is actually hanging in front of the cylinder a little bit. this baffle seal should be tucked up and inside the gap between the inside of the inlet and the top of the nose bowl. So you want to see that that's up there, otherwise you'll lose some cooling. Check it on both sides. It's not very hard to go around and push it back up where it belongs, but you do want it there. Coming down to the nose strut. The big thing to watch out for, down here under the nose strut, at the bottom of the strut where it comes through the nose fork assembly, there's a bolt that holds the fork onto the nose strut. And there's a big cotter pin that holds the bolt so it doesn't back off. Now if you can tell by touch that it's there, that's fine. Or you get yourself a little mirror and look underneath to see that that cotter pin is there and that the cotter pin feet are still bent out properly. Landing light, good on the screws that hold it in. Coming around to the side. Checking pretty much the same things on the left side of the engine compartment that I was checking on the right side. Looking for any sign of wiring issues, looking for any signs of corrosion, anything on the cylinders, looking for any sign of things hanging or dripping, fluid, wires, all that sort of thing. Looks good. So I'll button this one up. Now you may notice I've got a lot more stuff in here than most people because I have a JPI 930 engine panel. So I've got a manifold pressure line that leads to the manifold pressure sensor that leads through here to the manifold pressure sensor. I've got oil pressure, fuel pressure sensors, EGT, CHT wiring. So it's kind of busy in this engine compartment compared to the way it was when it came from the factory. Again, the baffle seal conditions, good touch here. Now on this side, you'll see that when I bring the down, the aft one clips in nicely, but the forward one is indented. That's what you don't want to see. Now, I could readjust this by rotating the and screwing this down, but if I do one turn, because you always have to have the little gap, the little indentation inboard where it'll engage. If I do it any further, one full turn, it'll either be too high or too low. So, it clipped that time. But if it doesn't clip when you do that, take the palm of your hand like this. Don't hit the cowl unless you want to change the shape of the cowl permanently. But if you do this, it won't put any indentations in the cowl. Looking here at the cooling inlet for the avionics, and then the NACA scoop for your cockpit cooling. And coming around this side, doing the usual things that we did on the other side. Looking at the rubber strip, and this one's good. Security of the wheel fairing. Condition of the rubber boot that goes on the landing strut. Now that rubber boot is something you have to be careful of because they can often split from the back side. And if it starts to split, it will continue to wear and start to flap. And when that happens, you will think that your airplane is about to fall out of the sky. The noise will be amazing. But the airplane is still perfectly safe even if that whole rubber boot comes off. It's mostly decorative and don't panic over that. Just give it a good check before flight, and you probably won't get surprised in flight. And the way you'll check that is to go around the back side of it and feel if there's any separation of the rubber at the back end. Now I'm looking at the tires, and I can see that I've got good grooves on the tires, both the main and on the nose tire. I've also got a good idea in my head of how much bulge there should be in the tire. And I know about what the tire should look like with the correct pressure, because it's kind of hard, we all know, to check the pressure if you've got fairings on. And that's being able to eyeball it and decide when I really need to go stick the tire pressure gauge on it will save you a lot of sweat and strain. Coming back around this side, checking the same things at the other side, looking at the fuel cap, looking at the fuel level, condition of the O-ring, and making sure it's aligned. And by the way, when I take off, about the time I'm crossing the departure end of the runway, I always look at both fuel caps to see if there's any fuel coming out. Because once you get about 100 miles an hour of airflow over there, it'll start sucking fuel out of there if there's any leakage or gaps. And that's a good time to find out about it, rather than 2 hours into the flight when you realize that you don't have quite enough fuel to get where you're going. Outside, continuing the stall strips, check for security. Wingtip cover, looks like this one needs a little cleaning. Coming around for the pitot tube. I don't even touch the pitot tube, I just look in it. And the fuel tank vent are both clear. And then all the things we checked on the other side, the aileron bearing, the flap aileron joint bearing, looking at the flap bearing plate that I have on this side compared to the roller on the other side, and the inner bearing on the flap. And that concludes my walk around. Now, we have here a 1974 Traveler. The nose will tell you right away it's a Traveler, except for the 75 Traveler, which has the same nose as the Cheetah. But a few things that we can see right off. Remember, I mentioned on my Tiger about taking a look at the tires, and if you take a look at this nose tire, you see the way it's a little lower and bulged out, and the wall of the tire is almost touching the ground. That tells you this tire needs air. Also, coming over here, this has the 72 through 78 fuel cap assembly, and if we can take a closer look, you can see the fuel cap is completely different. There is a rubber gasket here, which you want to check for condition, make sure it's not dry rotted or anything. We also have the scupper drain, that the fuel tank inlet is here, and then around it is kind of a moat. And any fuel that flows over the top is going to go into that moat, and then there's a drain line that runs all the way out right here is the drain from the scupper. So if it overflows, it's coming out here and it'll piddle on the ground right there. So if you fill the airplane on a hot day with fuel that isn't that hot, as it expands, you'll see it dribbling out. And that's one good way to find out if your tank is full. The scuppers have been known to separate from the upper wing surface. So always take a good look at the integrity of the scupper assembly and make sure that there's no separation up here. That's another one that's kind of hard to fix without taking the fuel tank apart. That's what you'd see on Travelers, all Travelers, plus Cheetahs and Tigers through the 78 model year. The 79s have the mil-spec cap. The Traveler has a completely different tail assembly, which it actually donated to the AA1C model. But the AA1C Lynxes have this same horizontal stab and elevator assembly as the Travelers all have. The Travelers also have a ventral fin in addition to the dorsal fin, which has to be checked for security. And also, we have a ventral fin, this big slab here. The tie-down ring is attached to the aft closure bulkhead, but it's on the left side of center. And it also means that if you over-rotate on a soft field takeoff, or if you get the nose too high on a landing, that little skid plate here is what will hit the ground. And that's what you would check for signs of the tail strike. And if you've had tail strikes in these planes, you need to do the inspection that's in the AA5 maintenance manual to look at the attachment where the horizontal stab aft spar attaches to the bulkhead in the fuselage section. There's also a counterweight in here, which you want to check for that it is present and it is secure. Free movement, no play in the bearing. And the trim arm assembly looks a little different here. I'm going to grab my light. Once again, you want to check, in this case, the cotter pin is on the inside, and there's no external washer like we saw on the Tigers and Cheetahs. But we want to check that, and again, if you can see where in level flight the point that it's going to be, and check to see in here if there's any sign of wear. You find just kind of a gouge down like that. Now the cowling assembly is completely different. The nose is completely different on the Traveler than on the Cheetah and Tiger, unless you're talking a 75 Traveler, which has a Tiger Cheetah cowl. We'll open the latches. Well, we've still got a strut, but I see this one has no button to stick it in. Notice a lot more space in this because the engine is physically smaller and a lot less wiring. But as always, we're looking for nothing hanging, nothing dripping. Ooh, colorful engine. That's cool. In any event, it's not really relevant to the pre-flight. But once again, nothing hanging, nothing dripping. You just got a little more room to see things because it is the smaller engine and there's a lot less stuff back here. And of course, it's a little trickier closing it because you have to line up the little groove with the, I think I got that. Come on. It's a lot easier in this with the larger inlet to check the tension on the alternator belt. You can't barely reach that on the Lopresti cowl that I have. Looking for this tension on the alternator belt. It should give you maybe an eighth to a quarter of a twist if you rotate the belt, and just have a little bit of movement, but not much if you push or pull on the alternator belt. And then of course, take a look inside, see the intake, and here you can see the air filter in the back. Making sure that's clear, no debris. And also you want to look at the scat tube and make sure it's secure. Checking around on the right side, of course the Travelers and the Cheetahs don't have, they've got the airflow from the front underneath to the carburetor, so there's no ducting. You can't see the air box really from here. So as less in the way, it's much easier to take a look at things. And I can see from the wear marks that through here, we've got a pretty tight fit. But along here, you also see the wear marks. So we've got a pretty tight fit all the way around, and that's good for cooling. And also I can see from the tab here on the pushrod tube that this is a high compression ST seed engine. That's pretty much your traveler differences. Now we have the Cheetah, which the big difference is forward of the firewall. Externally, the difference is the presence of the triple louvers and the air inlet here with a NACA duct leading down to the wire screen. It's very important that you take a look inside there and make sure that the wire screen assembly is properly secured, there's nothing loose, because this assembly is the subject of an AD note, and there's either you have to replace it with a different design from the original or else inspect it fairly regularly. The nose bowl, in this case, the shark nose, but this one has a split nose bowl. You can see the split line here, so that the nose bowl, which came as one piece, is now two pieces. The beauty of that is that your alternator and your starter are behind the nose wheel. And if you have a problem with either one, if you don't have the split nose, the only way to get the nose bowl off is to take the prop off first. And that increases the difficulty factor significantly. We have the nose bowl split. This one has the horizontal split. Tigers can also get a vertical split, but for a Cheetah, there's a problem doing a vertical split because of the air intake down here. Either way, it gives you the ability to get to the starter and alternator without pulling the prop off, and that's nice. Inside the engine compartment, it's the same as the Traveler, but you just got a little different shaped cowl to work around. And you got the pins so that when you shut down after landing, you can stand it on the pins to let some air come in to let the heat out and help the engine cool down after the flight. That's something we recommend. I noticed that this one does not have an oil door. Any questions?
Is that it?
That's it.